The most dangerous weapon in the world is not the bomb, it is love. The proof? Prince Leopold Clement, a soldier, a hussar officer of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, trained to face violence on the battlefield. But he did not die from an enemy's bullet. He was destroyed in a private apartment by the woman he loved. She didn't use a gun. She used acid, turning a prince's face into an unrecognizable nightmare. Forget the stories of empires. This is the story of a disfigured legacy, a chilling reminder that for Prince Leopold Clement, the most dangerous enemy was not on the battlefield, but right inside his own home. To understand this world, you must picture Vienna at the dawn of the 20th century, a city waltzing on the edge of a volcano. It was the magnificent beating heart of an empire that was both impossibly grand and terminally ill. The air itself seemed to crackle with a feverish energy. On the grand boulevards of the Ringstrasse, horse-drawn carriages glided past opulent opera houses and museums built to last 1,000 years. Inside the city's legendary coffee houses, the air was thick with the aroma of coffee, the sweet scent of pastries, and the smoke of intellectual debate. This was the Vienna where Sigmund Freud, in his study on Berggasse 19, was inventing a new language for the human soul, where Gustav Klimt was shattering old conventions, adorning his canvases with gold leaf and sensuous, erotic figures that were both a celebration and a critique of the city's decadent soul, where Gustav Mahler was pushing the symphony to its breaking point, filling the air with music that was both breathtakingly beautiful and filled with a sense of profound modern anxiety. But this golden haze of creativity was a beautiful lie, a glittering surface that concealed a foundation of deep and spreading cracks. The Austro-Hungarian Empire was a museum of peoples, Germans, Hungarians, Czechs, Poles, Croats, Serbs, and more, held together by the frail, aging figure of the emperor, Franz Joseph I, a lonely custodian of a glorious yesterday. Nationalism was the poison ivy twisting around the empire's pillars. In Prague, Czechs demanded their language be used in schools, a direct challenge to German dominance. In Budapest, Hungarian politicians chafed under Viennese authority, dreaming of their own imperial power. And in the south, in the volatile Balkans, the ominous rumblings of Slavic nationalism grew louder each year, threatening to ignite the entire continent. The whole magnificent structure was a masterpiece of art and culture, but it was a masterpiece built on a fault line. And for Prince Leopold Clement, this dazzling, dangerous city was not just a home. It was his entire world, a vast and demanding theater. Every day he walked its grand boulevards in his immaculate hussar's uniform, a living symbol of a dying order. Every night he sat in a private box at the opera, an actor playing the part of a serene and confident prince. He was expected to embody the stability and tradition of the empire while being acutely aware of the chaotic, revolutionary forces tearing it apart from within. He lived on a glittering stage, but it was a stage poised precariously on the edge of that volcano. He was a man forced to waltz gracefully, pretending not to feel the tremors beneath his feet, knowing that at any moment the beautiful music could stop and the floor could open up and swallow him whole. At the very pinnacle of this society sits the aristocracy, and within that elite, the imperial royal family and its orbiting constellations of German princely houses. Among the most distinguished of these is the House of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha. Originally rulers of a minor German duchy, they had, through a series of breathtakingly successful marriages, transformed themselves into a royal dynasty of international importance. They were, in essence, Europe's most successful exporters of royal husbands. Queen Victoria of Great Britain had married a Saxe-Coburg prince, Albert. Their children and grandchildren would come to occupy thrones from Britain to Russia, from Spain to Norway, making the Saxe-Coburgs the grandparents of an entire continent. Leopold's own relatives included King George V of Great Britain, King Albert I of Belgium, and the formidable Tsar Ferdinand I of Bulgaria. He was a member of a vast interconnected family web that was supposed to guarantee the peace and stability of Europe. It was a web that would soon become a tangle of enemies. Leopold belonged to a particularly unique and wealthy Catholic branch of this Protestant dynasty, the Saxe-Coburg-Kohari line. This branch was the result of one of the most brilliant and lucrative marriage coups of the 19th century. In 1815, Leopold's great-grandfather, Prince Ferdinand of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha, had married a young woman named Maria Antonia Kohari de Chabrag et Zitnia. She was not just any bride. She was the last of her ancient and incredibly wealthy Hungarian noble family. The Koharis were magnates who owned a staggering portfolio of properties across the empire, including vast agricultural estates, dense forests, profitable mines, and numerous castles and palaces, primarily in modern-day Slovakia and Hungary. When her father died, Maria Antonia became the sole heiress to this colossal fortune. However, the inheritance came with a series of ironclad legal conditions bound up in a document known as a fideicomissum, or an entailed estate. This was a legal trust designed to keep a great family's fortune intact and prevent it from being broken up or sold off over generations. The Kohari Trust stipulated that the fortune must pass undivided to the direct male heir of the family, who would in turn adopt the name and title of Kohari. By marrying Maria Antonia, the Saxe-Coburgs had hit the jackpot, but they had also accepted a golden handcuff. They had a sacred, legally binding duty to produce legitimate male heirs to keep the river of gold flowing. This duty fell squarely on the shoulders of Leopold's father, Prince Philip. As the eldest son of the second generation of Saxe-Coburg Koharis, he was the head of this wealthy branch. He was a quiet, scholarly man, a respected intellectual and numismatist. But his primary role in life was to secure the family's future. For that, he needed a wife of appropriate rank and a son. The wife he chose was Princess Louise of Belgium, the eldest and favorite daughter of the notorious King Leopold II. On paper, it was a spectacular match, uniting the wealth of the Koharis with the prestige of the Belgian royal house. In reality, it was a disaster. Princess Louise was a vibrant, free-spirited, and rebellious woman, ill-suited to the rigid, formal, and deeply conservative Viennese court. She found her husband dull and the social life stultifying. She embarked on a life of lavish spending, racking up astronomical debts, and soon, a series of scandalous love affairs. Her behavior became the talk of Europe, a constant source of humiliation for her husband and the entire imperial court. It was into this deeply dysfunctional and unhappy marriage that Prince Leopold Clement was born on July 19, 1878, at Schlosses Schentental. He was followed a year later by a sister, Dorothea. As the only son, Leopold was, from the moment he drew his first breath, the object of all his family's dynastic hopes and anxieties. He was the precious vessel that was destined to carry the family name and the Kohari inheritance into the next generation. This placed an almost unbearable weight of expectation upon his young shoulders. His childhood was a strange mix of immense privilege and profound emotional turmoil. He grew up in the opulent splendor of the Palais Coburg in Vienna and the family's vast Hungarian estates. He was waited on by servants, taught by private tutors, and dressed in the finest clothes. Yet the atmosphere at home was poisonous. His parents' marriage was collapsing in the most public and humiliating way possible. When Leopold was a teenager, his mother, Princess Louise, finally left her husband for a dashing Croatian cavalry officer, a commoner named Geza Matacic. The scandal was immense. They lived extravagantly across Europe, pursued by creditors, until King Leopold II and the Emperor Franz Joseph finally had enough. Princess Louise was declared insane, and in 1898 she was forcibly committed to a mental asylum, where she would remain for the next 6 years. Imagine the effect of this on a young man like Leopold. His own mother, a princess of Belgium, was the subject of lurid tabloid gossip, a woman publicly shamed and locked away. The scandal would have followed him everywhere, in the hushed whispers of courtiers and the knowing glances of his fellow officers. It likely instilled in him a deep-seated fear of public scandal and a profound understanding of the brutal consequences of defying social conventions. He saw firsthand what happened when personal passion was allowed to override dynastic duty. It was a lesson that would have been seared into his soul. In the wake of this familial chaos, Leopold threw himself into the one institution that offered structure, honor, and a clear code of conduct: the army. He enrolled in the Teresian Military Academy, the premier training ground for officers in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and emerged as a dedicated and capable soldier. He joined a prestigious cavalry regiment of the Hussars, the elite, flamboyantly uniformed light cavalry that were the pride of the Hungarian component of the imperial and royal army. Life as a hussar officer was a world of rigid discipline and hedonistic pleasure. Days were spent on the training grounds, mastering horsemanship and saber drills, while nights were spent in the exclusive officers' clubs and salons of Vienna and Budapest. It was a fiercely masculine world, governed by a strict code of honor that valued courage, loyalty to one's comrades, and a certain aristocratic disdain for the mundane concerns of civilian life. It was also a world where keeping a mistress was not only common, but was often seen as a status symbol, a private matter to be handled with discretion as long as it did not interfere with one's public duties, or, most importantly, one's eventual marriage prospects. For a young prince burdened by his family's scandalous past, the army provided a sense of belonging and purpose. He was respected not just for his title, but for his competence as a soldier. He was Captain Prince Leopold, a man of honor, serving his emperor in one of the finest regiments in the land. On the surface, he had successfully navigated the wreckage of his childhood and was now the model of a perfect, aristocratic heir. He was handsome, respected, and on a clear path to fulfilling his destiny. The future of the House of Saxe-Coburg-Kohari seemed secure in his capable hands, but the emotional damage of his upbringing, the deep-seated conflict between passion and protocol that he had witnessed in his own parents' disastrous marriage, had left invisible scars. And it was in the hidden world of his private life, away from the rigid order of the parade ground, that he would make the fateful decisions that would lead him down a path to utter destruction. This sanctuary, he found, was the Austrian military. For a young prince like Leopold Clement, it was more than just a career. In the wake of his mother's spectacular fall from grace, the army offered an escape into a world of reassuringly rigid structure and unambiguous honor. Here, a man was defined not by the scandals of his parents, but by the shine on his boots, the precision of his salute, and his unwavering loyalty to the emperor. The hussars, in particular, were the epitome of imperial glamour. They were a vibrant spectacle of blue and gold uniforms, of leopard skin saddles and sabers that flashed in the Viennese sunlight. To be an officer in such a regiment was to belong to an elite brotherhood, a world where courage on the training field and charm in the drawing room were the twin currencies of respect. For Leopold, this world provided a much-needed sense of identity. He was a good officer, serious, competent, and well-liked by his men and his peers. He excelled in the demanding disciplines of horsemanship and military strategy, finding a clean, simple satisfaction in the execution of his duties that was entirely absent from the messy, emotional landscape of his family life. He moved with the easy confidence of a man born to his station, his days filled with the rhythms of the barracks, and his evenings with the refined pleasures available to a young, handsome, and immensely wealthy aristocrat in one of Europe's most dazzling capitals. This was a life of formal dinners at the Sacher Hotel, of private boxes at the Vienna State Opera, of weekend hunting parties at the sprawling country estates of fellow noblemen. It was a life conducted according to an intricate and unspoken set of rules. And one of those rules, tacitly understood by all, concerned the matter of love and marriage. Marriage was a dynastic duty, a business transaction conducted for the benefit of the family. Love, if it existed at all, was a happy accident. Passion, on the other hand, was a dangerous commodity, something to be sought and enjoyed discreetly, far from the public eye, and never ever to be confused with the serious business of matrimony. For an officer and a prince, the institution of the mistress was a deeply ingrained part of this social fabric. She was a private indulgence, a companion for a man's leisure hours, but she was always understood to be temporary, a chapter in a man's life, not the entire story. It was within this context of accepted discretion and carefully managed desire that Prince Leopold, sometime in the very early years of the 20th century, first met Camilla Rebecca. The precise circumstances of their meeting are lost to the mists of history, shrouded in the secrecy that would define their entire relationship. It would not have been at an imperial court or an official state function. Her social standing would never have granted her access to such exclusive events. It is more likely they met in the city's other, more bohemian world, perhaps at a private salon hosted by an artist, a literary gathering, or through a mutual acquaintance in the theater world. Vienna was a city of layers, and beneath the formal crust of the court lay a vibrant, artistic, and intellectually daring society, where the rigid lines of class could, on occasion, become blurred. Camilla was a product of this other Vienna. She was not a princess, but she was far from a simple peasant girl. Born around 1876, she was the well-educated daughter of a respectable court official, a man who worked within the vast bureaucracy of the Hofburg Palace. She belonged to the city's prosperous and cultured bourgeoisie. She would have been fluent in German and French, well-read, and possessing a sophisticated appreciation for music and the arts. Photographs reveal a woman of striking dark-haired beauty, with intelligent, piercing eyes and a proud, confident bearing. She was not a demure, blushing debutante raised to curtsy and please. She was a modern woman possessing a sharp intellect and a fiery, passionate spirit that would have been both a shock and an irresistible attraction to a man like Leopold, who had been surrounded his entire life by the carefully controlled pleasantries of aristocratic women. Their connection was immediate and profound. For Leopold, meeting Camilla must have felt like stepping out of a stuffy, airless room into a sudden bracing gust of wind. In her company, the crushing weight of his title, his inheritance, and his family's expectations would have simply melted away. She did not see Captain His Serene Highness, Prince Leopold Clement of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha, heir to the Kohari fortune. She saw Leo, a man with a quiet charm, a gentle nature, and a deep well of sadness hidden behind his formal military demeanor. She could make him laugh. She challenged his opinions. She spoke to him not as a subject to a prince, but as an equal, a woman who was utterly unimpressed by the pomp and circumstance of his life. He was, in short, utterly captivated. And for Camilla, what did she see in him? She saw a handsome, powerful, and attentive man who clearly adored her. But more than that, she saw a man who seemed to need her, who found in her a refuge from his own gilded world. He was her prince, yes, but he was also a man she could comfort, a man whose hidden wounds she could tend to. A deep and powerful bond was forged, a bond that quickly grew far beyond the accepted conventions of a typical aristocratic affair. This was not to be a fleeting dalliance. It became the central defining relationship of Leopold's adult life. He soon established Camilla in a comfortable and elegant apartment in a fashionable district of Vienna, a private sanctuary where they could build a world of their own. For over a decade, this apartment became the true center of his emotional life. Here, protocol and etiquette were banished. Here, he could shed his uniform and the heavy mantle of his public identity and simply be himself. Their life together, though hidden, was rich and full. They shared a love of music and would attend concerts, sitting discreetly in a private box. They hosted intimate dinners for Leopold's closest circle of trusted officer friends, men who knew of and accepted Camilla's role in his life. At these gatherings, she was not a hidden mistress, but a gracious and accomplished hostess, the de facto lady of the house. She managed his private social life, advised him on personal matters, and provided the stable, loving, and intellectually stimulating partnership that had been so catastrophically absent from his own parents' marriage. She was, in everything but name and legal standing, his wife. And in the intimacy of this secret world, promises were inevitably made. Lovers, in the throes of passion and genuine affection, build futures out of words. He would have assured her of his love, of her unique and irreplaceable place in his life. He would have told her that she was different from all the others, that what they had was real. He may have even spoken of a future together, of a way, somehow, someday, to defy the conventions that sought to keep them apart. For a man deeply in love, such promises feel true in the moment they are uttered. But for the woman who hears them, a woman whose entire life and future is wagered on the strength of that man's love, those promises become the very bedrock of her existence. Camilla Rebecca staked her entire future on the strength of Leopold's promises. She believed his love was an unbreakable foundation. She would discover in the end that it was built on sand. While Leopold and Camilla were living their secret life in Vienna, the pressures of dynastic duty were closing in, slowly but inexorably. The pressure on Leopold to marry and produce an heir was not merely a matter of parental nagging. It was a concern of state for several branches of his powerful family. His father, Prince Philippe, was now in his late 60s, and his health was beginning to fail. He was becoming increasingly desperate to see the future of the Kohari inheritance secured before he died. The vast fortune was more than just money. It was the legacy of an entire lineage, and Philippe saw it as his sacred duty to pass it on, intact, to a legitimate grandson. An even more formidable source of pressure came from his uncle, the shrewd and ambitious Tsar Ferdinand I of Bulgaria. Ferdinand, a younger brother of Leopold's father, had, through a series of brilliant political maneuvers, elevated himself from a minor German prince to the crowned ruler of a kingdom. He was a man who understood power, wealth, and the importance of dynastic security. His own sons were providing heirs for the Bulgarian throne, but he kept a watchful and concerned eye on the future of the incredibly wealthy Kohari branch of the family, from which he also derived a significant portion of his own prestige and income. In his correspondence, he frequently expressed his anxiety about his nephew's unmarried status, urging his brother Philip to take decisive action. For these powerful men, Leopold's long-standing affair with Camilla Rebecca was an open secret and a growing source of alarm. In their world, such a relationship was acceptable as a youthful diversion, but for a man approaching his mid-30s, it was becoming a dangerous liability. It signaled a lack of seriousness, a potential for the kind of public scandal that had so damaged his mother's reputation, and most critically, it was an obstacle to the urgent business of finding a suitable royal bride. The search for a princess began in earnest around 1912. The criteria were strict and non-negotiable. She had to be of royal blood from a ruling or formerly ruling Catholic house. She needed to be young, healthy, and likely to produce children, preferably sons. And she had to be acceptable to the notoriously picky and protocol-obsessed court of the Emperor Franz Joseph. The great royal houses of Europe were scoured, genealogies were consulted, and diplomatic feelers were put out. The choice eventually fell upon a young woman who was on paper the perfect candidate, Princess Elvira of Bavaria. She was the daughter of Prince Arnulf of Bavaria and Princess Therese of Liechtenstein, making her a member of the powerful house of Wittelsbach, which ruled the kingdom of Bavaria. She was young, pretty, impeccably well-connected, and, crucially, a devout Catholic. Her bloodline was flawless, her reputation spotless. The match was deemed ideal by both families. For Leopold, this was the moment the two halves of his life, the public and the private, could no longer be kept separate. The theoretical pressure he had deflected for years had now materialized in the form of a specific woman, a specific wedding date, and a specific set of expectations he could no longer ignore. He was trapped. To refuse the match would be an act of open defiance against his father and his powerful uncle. It would be seen as an abdication of his most fundamental duty, potentially jeopardizing his inheritance and creating a massive family crisis. It would also be a profound insult to the royal house of Bavaria, a friendly and allied state. On the other hand, to accept the marriage meant betraying Camilla. It meant acknowledging that their decade of love, intimacy, and shared life had been nothing more than a placeholder, a temporary arrangement to be swept aside when serious matters were at hand. It meant breaking the promises he had made and destroying the woman he loved. We can only imagine the torment of his internal struggle. He was a man of honor, a soldier who believed in duty. The army had taught him to obey, to follow the chain of command, and the chain of command in his life led directly from his father to his emperor. His entire upbringing, his entire identity was predicated on the idea that he would one day step into his father's shoes, take on the responsibilities of his heritage, and secure the family's future. It was the very reason for his existence. And yet there was Camilla. She represented a different kind of life, a life of genuine emotion, of freedom, of personal happiness. To be with her was to be true to his heart. To leave her was to be true to his name. He was caught in an impossible conflict, and it was a conflict made all the more potent by the ghost of his mother. He had seen what happened when personal passion was allowed to run rampant. It led to ruin, disgrace, and exile. He was terrified of repeating her story, of bringing that kind of scandal upon his house again. Perhaps in his mind, the most dutiful, the most honorable, and even the most loving act was to make the clean, painful break, to choose order over chaos. Sometime in 1915, his decision was made. He would do his duty. He would marry Princess Elvira, and he would end his relationship with Camilla Rebecca. He approached the task with the cold, pragmatic logic of a military officer carrying out a difficult but necessary maneuver. He believed he could manage the situation, that he could control the outcome. He planned the breakup as one might plan a business negotiation. He would be firm, but generous. He would end the emotional connection, but secure her financial future. He would offer her a settlement so vast it would guarantee her a life of comfort and independence. The sum was reportedly 4 million Austrian crowns, an almost unimaginable fortune for a woman of her station. It was enough to buy a dozen grand townhouses in Vienna or a sprawling country estate. He likely saw this offer as the ultimate proof of his affection, a final grand gesture of his care for her. It was a way to soften the blow, to compensate her for her years of service, as it were. He tragically failed to understand that from her perspective, the offer of money was not a kindness. It was the ultimate insult. It was the final brutal confirmation that their decade of love, their shared life, their secret world had been, in his eyes, nothing more than an expensive long-term transaction. He was not just breaking her heart, he was attempting to purchase her silence, to pay her off like a dismissed employee. He failed to see that he was not dealing with a logistical problem to be managed, but with the raw, unpredictable, and increasingly desperate heart of a woman who felt her entire life was being stolen from her. In that catastrophic failure of empathy, he set in motion the tragedy that would ultimately consume them both. Having made his decision, Prince Leopold felt a profound, almost cleansing sense of relief. He believed the hardest part was over, that he had successfully navigated the messy terrain of human emotion and emerged back on the solid, reassuring ground of dynastic duty. He had honored his name, his father, and the future of his house. The 4 million crowns in his meticulously ordered logic was not a payoff, but a final, honorable act of care, a grand and generous settlement that closed the ledger cleanly, secured Camilla's future, and absolved him of any further entanglement. It was the solution of a gentleman, the final word in a negotiation he considered concluded. He resumed the life of a prince with renewed focus, immersing himself in the tangible preparations for his upcoming wedding to the Bavarian princess. His days once again filled with the comfortable rhythms of his station, diplomatic dinners, fittings for new ceremonial uniforms, and reviews of the vast estates he was destined to inherit. He likely instructed his staff that any correspondence from Camilla was to be dealt with discreetly, perhaps even left unopened. Her desperate letters, filled with a pain he could no longer allow himself to comprehend, were dismissed as a predictable and tiresome nuisance, the unseemly emotionalism of a woman who simply didn't understand the great, impersonal forces she was up against. Each frantic plea only served to reinforce his conviction that he had made the correct, rational choice. The soldier, a man trained to read a landscape for the subtlest sign of ambush and anticipate an enemy's charge across an open field, was utterly blind to the true nature of the battlefield he had just created. His strategic mind, so effective on the parade ground, was useless against an adversary whose motives were not tactical, but born of shattered love. He saw a logistical problem that had been solved, not a human heart that had been broken beyond repair. For him, the chapter was definitively closed, the book of his past neatly shelved. But he had no idea that, in the chilling silence he had imposed, a final horrifying chapter was being written for him in secret, and that, in the gathering darkness, the nightmare was just beginning. She knew she had one last card to play, Leopold's own sense of honor, perhaps mixed with a lingering flicker of guilt. She sent him one final message, its tone likely changed from the desperate pleas of before. It would have been calm, resigned, accepting. She was leaving Vienna, she might have said. She accepted his decision. All she asked for was one last meeting, a chance to say a dignified and final goodbye, to close this chapter of their lives with a semblance of civility. It was a masterful piece of psychological manipulation, an appeal to the very aristocratic code that was the cause of her suffering. And for reasons that will forever be debated, a momentary lapse in judgment, a sense of noblesse oblige to the woman he had once cared for, or perhaps the fatal arrogance of a man who simply could not conceive that a woman of her class could pose a genuine threat to a man of his. Leopold agreed. He would go to her apartment one last time, alone, to turn the final page. He walked into her home believing he was closing a chapter of his life. He could not have known she intended to end the entire book. He entered the apartment one last time on a mission of finality, a duty he intended to conclude with the same brisk efficiency he applied to his military affairs. The air was thick with unspoken words. The conversation was strained, a hollow exchange of pleasantries that felt obscene against the backdrop of their decade-long intimacy. Each polite phrase was a stone dropped into the gaping abyss of their shared betrayal. Finally, it was done. Believing the ordeal was over, he turned his back to walk towards the door, a wave of relief washing over him. He had turned his back on her and on the past. Suddenly, a deafening crack tore through the silence of the room, a sound so violent it seemed to suck the very air from his lungs. It felt less like a bullet and more like a physical blow from a sledgehammer, a brutal force that threw him from his feet. He crashed down onto the familiar Persian carpet, the intricate pattern rushing up to meet him in a blur of crimson and gold. For a disoriented moment, his soldier's mind tried to process the impossible event. In a daze of shock and pain, his gaze found hers. He looked up at the woman he once loved, searching for an answer, for a sign of a mistake, but he found nothing of the person he knew. The warmth and passion in her eyes had been extinguished, replaced by a cold, alien fury, a chilling void of purpose. Another shot rang out. The sound was sharper this time. The pain a white-hot spike through his hand as he instinctively raised it to defend himself. He was now helpless, a spectator to his own destruction. He watched through a swimming haze, as she moved not with panic or rage, but with a terrifying calm toward the small table where they had once placed bottles of wine and vases of flowers. His mind raced, struggling to comprehend her intent. Then he saw it, a small glass vial in her hand, catching the afternoon light. What was in that harmless-looking bottle? A sickening wave of comprehension washed over him, colder and more final than any fear he had ever known on the battlefield. It was vitriol. This was not a swift, honorable death. This was to be an unmaking. A supreme horror beyond all words seized him. This was not an execution. It was an erasure. Her work was now done. She had fulfilled her terrible promise to herself. The man she loved and the prince who had betrayed her were both gone, replaced by a screaming, writhing ruin on her floor. With the same chilling calm, she raised the revolver one last time. She placed the muzzle against her own chest, and with a final steady pull of the trigger, she ended her own life. She collapsed, her body falling near Leopold's. The two of them united at last in a final gruesome tableau of love, hate, and death. The sounds of the gunshots and the horrifying screams had not gone unnoticed. Neighbors, terrified, summoned the police. When they finally forced their way into the apartment, they were met with a scene of almost unimaginable horror. The air was thick with the smell of gunpowder and the acrid stench of the chemical agent. On the floor lay the lifeless body of Camilla Rebecca, a single fatal wound to her chest. And nearby, his features erased, was Prince Leopold, still alive, writhing in agony, his face a smoking, blackened ruin. The scandal exploded across Vienna like a bomb. The imperial and royal court, an institution built on the foundations of image, discretion, and the suppression of scandal, was thrown into a state of absolute panic. This was not a distant political assassination or a noble death on the battlefield. This was a sordid, violent, and deeply embarrassing crime of passion involving a high-ranking member of a ruling house. It was, in short, a public relations nightmare of the highest order. The machinery of the establishment swung into action. A wall of official silence was erected. The police investigation was conducted with the utmost secrecy. The press was fed a heavily sanitized and minimalist version of events, one that spoke of a tragic incident and a demented woman, carefully omitting the most lurid details, especially the acid attack. The court's primary objective was damage control to protect the reputation of the dynasty and to frame the narrative in a way that placed all blame squarely on the shoulders of the dead woman, painting her as a monstrous and hysterical villain. But the truth was too sensational to be contained. Whispers slithered through the salons, coffee houses, and military barracks of the empire. The horrifying details, the gunshots, and especially the vitriol, became the subject of morbid, fascinated gossip. The story raised deeply uncomfortable questions about the private lives of the aristocracy. It exposed the brutal hypocrisy at the heart of their social code, a code that allowed a prince to maintain a woman for a decade and then attempt to dismiss her with a bank draft. Camilla Rebecca, in her final terrible act, had not just destroyed a prince. She had ripped the elegant curtain from the Viennese stage, exposing the ugly, brutal reality of what could happen when the passions of the human heart were trampled by the cold calculus of dynastic duty. For the prince himself, now lying in a hospital bed, the debates of society were a world away. His ordeal, the final and most agonizing chapter of his life, had only just begun. The harsh, sterile light of the Louvre Sanatorium in Vienna was a world away from the gilded elegance of the Hofburg Palace. But for Prince Leopold Clement, it had become the entire universe. As he was rushed through its doors, a team of the Austro-Hungarian Empire's finest physicians descended upon him. They were men accustomed to treating the ailments of emperors and archdukes, gout, pneumonia, the gentle declines of old age. They were utterly unprepared for the horror that lay on the stretcher before them. What they saw was not a patient in the conventional sense. It was a living, breathing testament to an act of infernal cruelty. The initial assessment was a grim catalogue of devastation. The 2 gunshot wounds, one to the chest and one to the hand, were serious, but in the grim calculus of his injuries, they were almost secondary. It was the vitriol that had sealed his fate. The concentrated sulfuric acid had done its work with terrifying efficiency. His face, once the handsome aristocratic visage of a future duke, was gone. Skin, muscle, and cartilage had been dissolved, exposing the underlying bone in places. His eyelids were burned away, and the chemical had poured into his eyes, destroying the corneas and optic nerves completely. Prince Leopold Clement was permanently and irrevocably blind. He would never see the sky, a friendly face, or his own reflection again. He was plunged into a world of absolute, unending darkness, a darkness that would be punctuated only by the searing flashes of unimaginable pain. The immediate medical response was a frantic exercise in damage control. The primary enemy was not just the visible wounds, but the invisible one, infection. In 1915, before the age of widespread antibiotics, sepsis was a death sentence for even the strongest of men. Every exposed surface of his face and chest was a potential gateway for bacteria. The doctors and nurses began a grueling and torturous daily regimen of cleaning the wounds, debriding the dead tissue, and applying what primitive antiseptic solutions they had at their disposal. Each treatment, intended to save his life, was a fresh wave of agony. His muffled screams, filtered through bandages and destroyed vocal cords, would have become a familiar and haunting sound in the private wing of the sanatorium. For the pain itself, they had only one true weapon: morphine. The drug became his constant companion, a blessed chemical fog that offered temporary retreat from the fiery torment that had become his reality. But it was a fickle savior. It clouded his mind, dragged him into delirious nightmares, and its effectiveness would wane, requiring ever larger doses. He was caught in a vicious cycle, trapped between the agony of his injuries and the stupor of the medication meant to relieve them. His existence had been reduced to its most fundamental and horrific terms. He could not see, could barely speak, and every sensation was a variation on the theme of pain, leaving him with a single horrifying imperative: to endure the next minute and then the one after that. Outside the padded doors of his sick room, another kind of battle was being waged, a battle for the family's reputation. His father, Prince Philip of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha, was a man broken by the catastrophe. When he first saw his son, the heir to whom he was to pass the vast Kohari fortune and titles, he was confronted with a sight that defied comprehension. This was not his son, the dashing cavalry officer, the celebrated sportsman. This was a ruin, a tragic remnant swathed in bandages. Prince Philippe was torn between two powerful, conflicting impulses. On one hand was the profound instinctual grief of a father, watching his child suffer an agony worse than death. On the other was the cold, ingrained duty of a dynastic prince. The scandal had to be managed. The family's name had to be protected. His visits to the sanatorium were a study in aristocratic fortitude and private anguish. He would sit by his son's bedside, perhaps attempting to offer words of comfort that sounded hollow, even to his own ears. What could one say to a man in such a state? He would then leave the room, his face a mask of iron control, to confer with court officials and doctors, orchestrating the official narrative. Publicly, the prince was a heroic victim of a mad woman's attack. Privately, he was the source of a deeply shameful scandal that threatened to tarnish the family's reputation for generations. Philippe had to navigate the whispers at court, the barely concealed pity in the eyes of his peers, and the horrifying reality that the future he had so meticulously planned for his son and for his house had been dissolved in a vial of acid. An even more tragic and complex figure in this drama was Leopold's mother, Princess Louise of Belgium. The irony of the situation was almost Shakespearean in its cruelty. Louise was the daughter of the infamous King Leopold II of the Belgians, and was herself a notorious royal outcast. Years earlier, she had caused an immense scandal by leaving Prince Philippe for her lover, Count Geza Matacic, running up enormous debts across Europe. Her behavior had led to her being declared insane and institutionalized for years. She was estranged from her children, a pariah forbidden from contacting the family she had disgraced. Now her own son had become the center of a love affair scandal that dwarfed her own in its violent conclusion. Did she hear the news in her gilded exile? Of course. Did her heart break for the son she was not allowed to see? Undoubtedly. One can only imagine her attempts to reach out, letters sent that were never delivered, messages passed through intermediaries that were politely but firmly rejected by her estranged husband. For Prince Philippe, allowing his scandalous wife anywhere near his suffering, son would have been unthinkable. It would only add another layer of public shame to an already unbearable situation. And so, Princess Louise was forced to grieve from a distance, a mother unable to comfort her dying child, her own past sins echoing in the tragedy of his present. The very system of aristocratic honor that Leopold had sought to uphold by leaving Camilla was the same system that now barred his own mother from his side in his hour of greatest need. And what of the young woman who was to be his bride, Princess Elvira of Bavaria? The news would have reached the Bavarian court not as a human tragedy, but as a diplomatic and dynastic crisis. The engagement was, of course, over. There was no possibility of a marriage between the beautiful young princess and the man who now lay blind and disfigured in Vienna. The dissolution of the engagement would have been handled with cold, formal efficiency. Letters of condolence would have been exchanged between the two royal houses, expressing deep regret over the unfortunate incident. But behind the polite language, the message was clear. The alliance was off, the contract was void. Princess Elvira was quietly removed from the equation, her life allowed to proceed down a different path, while the man who was to have been her husband was left to languish in his Vienna hospital room. His identity as a suitable husband, a key part of his princely role, had been as utterly destroyed as his physical face. While the family grappled with its private grief and public shame, the official narrative machine of the imperial court continued its work. The bulletins released to the anxious press were masterpieces of vagueness and optimistic spin. His Imperial and Royal Highness is resting comfortably. The prince's condition is stable and the doctors are hopeful. His Highness is showing great fortitude in the face of his ordeal. The Viennese public was presented with a story of a brave prince fighting for his life, a noble victim of a deranged woman's inexplicable rage. The horrifying specifics, particularly the use of acid, and the true extent of his disfigurement, were suppressed as much as possible. Camilla Rebecca was painted in the press as a monster, a hysterical and possessive creature who, when faced with the end of a tawdry affair, resorted to an act of inhuman violence. There was no room in this official story for nuance, no mention of a decade of devotion, of promises made and broken, or of the brutal social calculus that had driven her to despair. But Vienna was a city of whispers, and the truth, or at least a more lurid version of it, slithered through the coffee houses and salons. The details of the vitriol attack were too shocking to be contained. It became a cautionary tale, a subject of morbid fascination. While the official narrative demanded sympathy for the prince, the unofficial one was far more complex. In the drawing rooms of the bourgeoisie and the barracks of common soldiers, some may have debated Camilla's motives. Was she truly a monster, or was she a victim of a cruel and hypocritical system? She had given the best years of her life to a man who, when it suited him, tried to pay her off like a servant. Her final horrific act, while universally condemned, was seen by some as the desperate lashing out of a woman with nothing left to lose. The story laid bare the ugly double standard at the heart of aristocratic life. A prince's indiscretion was an accepted part of life, but a common woman's love was a disposable commodity. While the world outside debated his story, Prince Leopold Clement existed in a world that had shrunk to the confines of his own mind. In the long hours between the morphine haze and the waves of pain, what did he think about? Trapped in the silent, featureless dark, his memory would have been his only companion and his greatest tormentor. He would have had nothing to do but replay his life, moment by moment. Did he see Camilla's face as it once was, smiling at him across a dinner table? Did he hear her laughter? Did he remember the promises he made to her in the heat of passion? Promises to always care for her, promises that he had ultimately broken on the altar of dynastic duty? We can never know the true nature of his thoughts, but it is impossible to believe he was not overcome by waves of regret, rage, and perhaps finally a terrible understanding. The arrogance of the prince, the certainty of the man who believed he could control his own destiny and manage the lives of others, had been burned away. He was now utterly helpless, dependent on others for his every need, unable to even see the faces of his caregivers. Did he finally understand the depth of Camilla's despair? Did he comprehend that for her, the life he had asked her to leave was the only life she had? He had tried to buy her silence for 4 million crowns, and in return, she had paid him back with a pain that no fortune on earth could ever heal. He had learned in the most brutal way imaginable that the human heart cannot be managed like a bank account. His physical decline continued over the next 6 months. The doctors fought a valiant but ultimately hopeless battle. The massive trauma his body had endured, combined with the constant threat of infection from the chemical burns, was too much to overcome. The official reports continued to speak of stability, but the reality was a slow, inexorable slide towards death. The fevers came more frequently. He slipped into periods of delirium, his tormented moans perhaps calling out names from a past he could no longer see. His powerful constitution, honed by years of military training and sport, finally began to fail. By the spring of 1916, it was clear the end was near. The focus of his medical care shifted from cure to comfort. The family knew they were losing him. Prince Philip would have kept his vigil, watching the last vestiges of his son's life flicker and fade. On April 27, 1916, approximately 6 months after the attack, Prince Leopold Clement's suffering finally came to an end. He died at the age of 37. The official cause of death was listed as blood poisoning, a common euphemism for the sepsis that had finally overwhelmed his system. But everyone knew the truth. He had died on that autumn afternoon in Camilla Rebecca's apartment. It had simply taken his body 6 months to follow his soul into the grave. His death was not a final tragedy, but a final release from a life of unimaginable suffering. The prince was dead, but the story and the questions it raised about the glittering, brittle world he inhabited were far from over. The death of a prince, even in the midst of a cataclysmic war that was consuming a generation of European men, was an event of great state significance. The funeral of Prince Leopold Clement was a meticulously staged piece of imperial theater, a final somber performance designed to impose order and dignity upon a story that was defined by chaos and shame. He was laid to rest in the ducal crypt in Coburg, the final resting place of his ancestors. The ceremony was attended by the highest echelons of a dying empire, archdukes and princes, their chests heavy with medals that seemed to offer little protection from the brutalities of the modern world, gathered to pay their respects. The eulogies would have been carefully worded, speaking of a brave soldier and a noble prince struck down by a cruel twist of fate. They would have mentioned his service to the emperor, his dedication to his regiment, and the bright future that had been stolen from him. They would have spoken of everything except the truth. No one mentioned Camilla Rebecca. No one spoke of the apartment in Vienna. No one uttered the word vitriol. In the sanitized, incense-filled air of the crypt, the horrifying reality of his last 6 months and the decade that preceded it was officially erased, replaced by a more palatable narrative of tragic, blameless victimhood. The funeral was not just an act of mourning. It was the final act of the court's damage control, an attempt to seal the scandal in the tomb, along with the prince's body. Camilla's fate was the complete opposite. Socially discarded for committing suicide, she was denied a Catholic burial and interred in an unmarked grave, her identity erased and remembered only as the demented woman. Meanwhile, Leopold's death triggered a succession crisis over the immense Kohari fortune. However, the dynastic system quickly reset itself. Lawyers resolved the inheritance, the wealth was transferred to another branch of the family, and the impersonal machine of power and assets moved on. Their personal tragedy was ultimately reduced to a reallocation of assets on a balance sheet. This story is more than a crime of passion. It's a brutal reflection of a decaying world order. It took place in 1916 as the Austro-Hungarian Empire was crumbling during World War I. Leopold was a product of a rigid world that placed dynastic duty above love and personal happiness. His intensely personal and gruesome death stands in stark contrast to the anonymous slaughter on the battlefields, a reminder that even during grand historical shifts, individual fates are still sealed by the most primal emotions. In retrospect, neither Leopold nor Camilla were simple heroes or villains, but tragically flawed human beings. Leopold's fatal flaw was a failure of imagination. He couldn't comprehend the depth of Camilla's love and dehumanized her by treating her as a problem to be managed. Camilla's monstrous act, in turn, was not random madness, but the nihilistic response of a woman whose identity was completely annihilated when her love was reduced to a monetary price. Ultimately, this is a timeless tragedy about the collision between rigid social structures and the chaotic passions of the human heart. It is the sad story of two people, bound by a genuine but unequal love, who destroyed each other because the world they inhabited had no honorable place for them.